Welcome, Marc-Alain. I'll just introduce your session. So Marc-Alain, as I said, is the director of, Marc-Alain Mallet is the director of the New Brunswick Human Rights Commission. Marc-Alain is a seasoned executive with over 30 years of experience managing programs in both the provincial and federal public sectors. He was appointed director of the New Brunswick Human Rights Commission on July 6, 2015. The Commission is the independent government agency responsible for administering the Human Rights Act. Today, Marc-Alain leverages his experience to ensure the Commission's work and mandate remain relevant. He's also currently the national chair of the Canadian Association of Statutory Human Rights Agencies. So very welcome. Thank you so much for presenting to us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Nicole. So I take it you can hear me and
Absolutely.
And you can see my screen as well.
Absolutely.
The presentation mode. Okay. Technology never ceased to amaze, even though we just spent 2 years in training during the pandemic with the Zoom session, MS Teams, and God knows whatever other VC platform, and we still have issues. Anyways, we'll pick up the time as we go. So thank you very much for this opportunity to talk a little bit about the Human Rights Commission and about our work and how we're structured. Addressing systemic discrimination. When I got the email from Bronwyn to discuss this topic and to talk about the Commission in this context, it's a little bit presumptuous on my part to say that we're addressing systemic discrimination, but in a way we are. Systemic discrimination does fall under the jurisdiction of our legislation, and I'll give you an overview of how that came about. So a couple of things about human rights. So I'll cover the statutory and administrative framework. So a bit about our legislation and a bit about the Commission as a whole and how we're structured. I won't go into too many details about the actual all the different provisions. We've got other presentation, and I have people in the Commission that are much better versed at it than I am, but I will cover some of the key provision. I'll talk about our compliance process, and I'll talk about advancing this human rights culture. That's the raising awareness and some of the changes that the Commission has done over the last few years to be better prepared to work in an environment where our socio-demographic framework changes are constantly evolving. So now I'm going to take a step back. I just realized that we have interpreters providing interpretation services, and I have a tendency to speak a little bit fast. That's the French. I do apologize to my colleagues. Being a translator by trade, I'm going to try to tone it down a bit. So the Human Rights Act was assented in May of 1967. We're one of the first human rights commissions to have evolved from a previous attempt to provide a legal framework around human rights, and that's the predecessors around fair accommodation legislation and the work that the International Labor Organization to structure the world of work, which is related to today's topic, started in 1919. So there's been a constant evolution to provide a framework to protect people's human rights, but also to provide a framework to educate about those mechanisms and to educate about the principles of diversity, inclusion, and human rights. So that's the framework or the basis of the human rights legislation that we have today. I said we're one of the first. The Ontario Human Rights Commission was the first one to be created through legislation, and then subsequently New Brunswick, Nova Scotia about the same time, and later on the Canadian Commission and the rest of the provinces. So with the creation of the creation of the Human Rights Act came the creation of the Human Rights Commission. A couple of important aspects of our commission. So we're a citizens commission, meaning that commission members are appointed from the general public. They come from all walks of life. And the commission, it's important that the commission is made up of members that represents New Brunswick society. And as you can imagine, New Brunswick society is constantly evolving. So there's a lot of effort to raise awareness about the presence or the existence of the Human Rights Commission, and to encourage citizens to consider serving on the commission. And I'll talk a little bit about the role of what a commission member does. The other aspect, commission members are supported by commission staff, and we are part of the civil servant. The commission is currently made up of about 19 employees, located in 2 sites here in Fredericton, but also in Dieppe, and I'll talk about the various responsibilities later. The commission is some of the key principles that frame our work is we're unbiased and we're an impartial third party. Our role is there to administer the Human Rights Act, our legislation. So we don't advocate for or represent the parties. As a first generation Human Rights Commission, our role is there to be the first decider on human rights complaint. And then should the complaint or the situation meet certain requirements, then the case or the complaint move forward to a board of inquiry. And that's where the decision of whether discrimination has occurred or not will take place. A couple of things about human rights legislation. The Human Rights Act is quasi-constitutional, so it gives it a special status within the jurisprudence, and it's related to quasi-constitutional because it relates to individual rights. And it relates to those statutes that deals with right. Another important factor to remember about human rights legislation is that you can't contract out of human rights in general. There are exceptions, but very few, as in the case of the Canadian Charter and Human Rights, which take precedence over our legislation. We've if you attended Manju's presentation earlier, I think it's an excellent segue into mine, as she dealt with the notions and the principle around systemic discrimination and systemic racism, and she touched on some of those points as well. So what is exactly discrimination? So it's not really defined into our legislation. But it is a treatment or that is on the basis of one of more of our protected ground. You don't have to demonstrate intent, and policies that and we see this often where policies are put in place and they on the face they look like they are fair and equally apply to employees, but in the background they have the effect of being discriminatory. And in some circumstances, an unfair treatment doesn't really mean discrimination. And I know that sounds the opposite, but it would be cases where a program is put in place to advance a segment of our population or segment of society that requires it. A key aspect of our legislation are the grounds in the area. So in 1967, just to give you an idea of the evolution of human rights law in this province, but also in Canada in general, when the legislation was first enacted, it included 6 grounds of discrimination, and actually 4 of them were used related to employment provisions. Those were race, national origin, color, and religion. And the last revision of our legislation dates back to 2017. Um, um, at the time, it was the 50th anniversary of our legislation, and that was the last time that grounds were added. So what's the Prima Facie test? That basically is the first test that a complaint would go through. So if you feel that you've been discriminated against in one of the 5 sectors under our legislation and one of the 16 grounds, so the complainants would have to show that they have a protected characteristic that's enumerated or listed, indicated in the Human Rights Act. And as part of their complaint, they would have to explain how that created an adverse impact for them. And then the last component, they would have to indicate why or what was the factor that created this adverse impact. And often, when we have this, when we receive complaint, those are the most important factor at that initial state to be able to determine if a complaint is going to move forward within the complaint or the compliance process. So it's important for us to, when we receive complaints, to really analyze them in the sense of if that prima facie case wasn't demonstrated, is it because it is not a case of discrimination? Or is it because the person is not familiar with our process, doesn't understand what is prima facie, doesn't quite understand what the various elements are required in order to be able to demonstrate that they've been the victim or they've been the victim or the subject of a discrimination case. So that's why the Commission constantly revised our offering in terms of publications, conduct seminars, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, of how we ensure that our process and how to navigate our process is explained as simple as possible, and that we develop tools to address various circumstances that may happen as part of a discrimination case. Like any process, there are exceptions. So under subsection 2.2 of our legislation, it states that it's not a discriminatory practice if we make the determination, and that's one of the important part. It's the Commission needs to make this determination, not the organization or the agency or the business that has implemented a policy or a practice. And it's and that practice needs to be based on a bona fide requirement of qualification that justify this discrimination. So, for example, there are certain occupations where there are some physical goals or physical requirements that are required, so that standards, if you want, are connected to the goal of the purpose. So you need to be able to, and I'm using a very simple example, but you need to be able to lift this much weight. And that's because in the context of that specific work or area, this is something that you do on a regular basis. And that standard is the minimum. So it's been adopted in good faith, and it is required. And if you didn't have that, then the person wouldn't be able to do their job in a safe and secure manner. But again, that determination, when it is brought forward, needs to be done by the Commission. So we talked about this earlier. Our society is constantly evolving. So you can just imagine from those 6 grounds of discrimination that first made up the Human Rights Act to today, where we have 16. That's because society, people advanced, that they wanted to clarify the better protections because society evolves. So the commission, in order to be able to fulfill its mandate, we also have to evolve constantly, evolve from a legal perspective by advancing or suggesting to government changes that would better reflect the environment that the commission is working in, but also internally to make us more effective, because of the increase of complaints that we're filing, but also the complexity and the types of complaints. And also to maintain this balance between compliance and education and awareness. There was a period where the whole, let me go back a little bit more, the whole notion of human rights commissions was to address a lack, if you want, about the ability of commission to provide education programs, to do public education, to raise awareness about issues. And unfortunately, over the years, that mandate kind of was, compliance took over on the public education. And it's only over the last few years that we're reestablishing this balance, because public education is one of the key tools that we have to address barriers and change mindsets. So currently, the commission is focused on this compliance mandate, also on mediation, because mediation is one of our key tools in order to fulfill our legislation. There is a provision in our legislation that the commission is there to effect a settlement and inquiry into complaints. Mediation is a very effective tool in order to be able to address certain types of discrimination case that's being filed at the commission. And then there's public education about our process and about the legislation, and our advocacy. Advocacy to bring different types of issues or circumstances to public interest and raise awareness about it. So how is the commission structured? The current chair of the commission is Claire Roussel Sullivan. The chair is essentially responsible to the minister for the legislation, and in my role as the director, I support the members, the commission members, in this task. There are currently 6 commission members that are appointed on a 3-year period or 3-year mandate, and those are staggered and they vary. Reappointment are also possible. Under a case management and resolution, this is where all complaints would come in. They include the registrar office, which oversees our mediation section, and all the administration component of the commission. Legal affairs, which is composed of a general counsel and 2 legal counsel. As you can imagine, most of our work is heavily ingrained in legal principles. So it's a part of the commission that's very busy. Was there a question, Nicole, or it's just feedback?
Yes, there is. There's a question, and the question is, how does one approach the commission to add an identifiable sector to the list? So how do you add one of those 16 to make it 17?
Well, there's several ways. The commission on a regular basis will monitor the evolution of case law, will monitor the types of complaints that we're receiving, and on a regular basis will provide those recommendations to the department. In this case, the minister responsible is the Minister of Post-Secondary Education, Training and Labor. And those changes are then, those recommendations are then considered by government. Another aspect, and as we've seen in other grounds, is when the populations, different advocacy groups bring forward changes to their to the legislative process, so to their MLEs, their MPs, or directly to the department.
Thank you very much. It's interesting the way that those evolutions happen.
And then, of course, our investigation team, which is made up of head of investigations and currently 5 investigators. And then a newly created group called Advocacy with a manager and an education officer and a program officer. So this group would be responsible for raising awareness, so education, communication, especially research, which is something that we're doing a lot more, both research from the evolution of case law and jurisprudence, but also taking a better look at the type of complaints that the commission receives to establish different types of if there are trends, and sharing that information, that raw data, into information so they can better inform the public policies or programming. So now that's the compliance process. So I'll walk you through it to get a sense of what's involved. And I know that as any legal process, it may sound overwhelming, but we have really good people at the Human Rights Commission. So here's how it would be a typical scenario. Someone would contact the Human Rights Commission, so they would speak with one of our intake officers. That could be via different types of channels, phone, email, in person, and they would discuss their conversation. That on a typical year happens over 2,000 times a year. Someone will call the commission, they'll say, well, my employer is doing this, or I'm being refused an apartment because of that. And our intake officers will get information and provide information to the party. Our complaint form is now online. It's been online for the last few years, but we also send complaint kits for people who prefer to have a hard copy. They will fill the information. We also have a fair amount of resources on our website, and also that we can send out that will explain all the different sections of our complaint process, our complaint form, and how to fill them. Once we receive this information, it'll go to the registrar office. So there'll be an initial triage that's done, and then we make a determination, well, is the information complete? Are there any sections that are missing? Is it our jurisdiction? And then if it's not our jurisdiction, and for a couple of other reasons, then the complaint may be dismissed at that stage. And then a report, usually a couple of pages, form letter with an explanation is being sent to the complainant. But if the information is if it is our jurisdictions and we feel further inquiry is required, then it goes to the complaint form revision. So that's that stage. We'll make sure that is the information on the complaint form complete? Is there anything missing? And we'll contact the complainant, and we'll discuss with the person what's required in terms of form. Often, if it's a complaint that's dealing with an accommodation at work or something along those lines, there'll be medical information that's required, and that's usually where that would be fulfilled.
Marc-Alain,
yes.
We've had a question. Someone would like to know, what does accessibility considerations look like in the complaint process for persons with disabilities, sensory, intellectual disability, or other neurodiversity?
You mean as part of a complaint form, or in terms of how does the commission deal with people who to make sure that our process is accessible as possible?
I would imagine both, in that, how do you make sure that someone who maybe has a a disability that would require a different kind of access to the form can access the form, but also then how maybe neurodivergent or intellectually disabled people are able to access the commission's processes.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and it's an area that we're still looking internally on how to improve this. So often, what we'll see is, for example, someone wanting to file a complaint, and the person is within a correctional facility. So there's a lot of coordination that needs to be done with the Department of Justice and other institution, and our mediators and our complaint folks will be able to facilitate that. Other times, it'll be somebody who's will say, well, I have a learning impairment or a learning disability. Our intake, our registry officers will work with the person in order to help them file a complaint. Where there's a separation is that we can help someone understand what's required in the form, but we can't write it for that person. So we've been looking at other agencies that might be able to assist us in that respect. And that's something that that includes, you know, universities, legal offices. Is there any pro bono type of mechanism that we can put in place? We're also looking at can we expand places, because not everybody has access to I know it's kind of hard to say, but even in today's standard, not everybody has access to the internet or access to a computer. So that's why we still have the ability to file a complaint via mail, or someone can visit one of our sites and ask to see a registry officer about filing a complaint. They'll help them there.
Thank you for that. So we have another question here. If a complaint is made by a temporary foreign worker, would the commissioner consider it, even if the TFW program is federal?
Yes, and we do that. That's an interesting question because it opens up another door. I was going to talk about it later on, but it's maybe a good place to address it. So the New Brunswick Human Rights Commission is part of this national association called the Canadian Association of Statutory Human Rights Agencies. And while our legislation and our structures and our governance and so on are somewhat different across the country, we strive, all those agencies that are mandated or legislated to oversee human rights, complaint process and education, we work very much together to make sure that our processes and our approach are harmonized. And we've also developed, and for this specific question, we've developed protocols to make sure that if someone files an entry point, so if somebody files within the federal commission and it's not their jurisdiction, they'll be able to reroute this application. And the same goes for New Brunswick. If someone files with the New Brunswick Human Rights Commission and we establish that it's a federal matter, there's a mechanism that we can trigger. First we do the analysis, and then there's a mechanism that we can trigger to reroute that form or that complaint or that individual to the right agency. I should have pointed out that when someone calls the intake process, it's always over 2,000 inquiries a year, and it's been like that for several years. But not all of those 2,000 inquiries will lead to an actual formal human rights complaint. Out of that numbers, and I forget the exact numbers, but it's anywhere between 500 to 600 will be referrals. So we'll refer people to other parts of government, other agencies. We do our very best to make sure that we just that we provide a next step for people who are calling us for sometimes issues or situations that they have that doesn't fall under our jurisdiction.
That makes a lot of sense. I can certainly understand, but if someone has come to you with something that really should be with the federal commission, you don't want them to be put off pursuing their concerns by having to be turned around. You don't want them to have to start at zero again in a way that might lead them not to go forward. And so I think that that's really nice and a real comfort to know that the commissions across the country are working together to try and assure that people have that kind of assistance when they need to be redirected to the right place.
Yes, because you know, filing a human rights complaint is often a very traumatic and difficult thing to do. That's why our intake folks are trained in different types of trauma-informed practices to make sure that we're able to deal with different types of callers. Some people are calling us very distressed. Others are plain mad. Mad in the sense of upset, anger. So we need to be able to diffuse those situations. So our intake folks are well trained in those areas, and we do our best to make sure that we're able to provide the follow-up that people are looking for.
Mm-hmm.
And but it's not it's really not an easy and it's not an easy component of our human rights complaint.
Mm-hmm. We have another question here. Tamara has asked, will the commission proceed with a complaint if there is a simultaneous grievance happening?
Yes. Again, one thing with human rights is there's always a gray area, but I say yes. We have, in many circumstances, we have concurrent, our human rights complaint can proceed in concurrent processes. But again, that's an assessment that'll be done by our legal department. There are some legal proceedings, for example, that the commission will wait on the outcome of those proceedings before proceeding with our own human rights complaint, but only after some form of assessment has been done.
Thank you for that answer. That's it for questions. If you want to jump ahead, and I'm sorry we delayed your presentation.
No, it's okay. All right. Where was I? Oh yes, good thing about graphics. It's easier to get back to it. Okay, so after the complaint form revision, then the complaint notification is done. So that's where we notify the other parties. Those will be the respondents to a complaint. And we'll provide them with an opportunity to, we'll explain what the complaint is about, that the commission has not made a finding. So there's a whole list that our mediators will go through with the respondent. And often it will depend if the respondents are represented by legal counsel or if they're not. Those are all things that will be discussed at that stage. We offer mediation pretty much every step of our compliance process, and it's up to, we can't enforce it. We offer it and we run the process, and we'll facilitate, I should say. And but it's up to the parties to agree to it or not. And then at that stage, that's where we get into the response and the rebuttal. So complaint's been filed. Respondents have an opportunity to provide a response. Once they get a response, the information is sent to the initial complainant, who has an opportunity to provide a rebuttal. And I say opportunity because they don't have to. Once we have this information, those at the most 3 documents, then that's where we'll conduct the next step analysis. So based on the information provided, if you recall to my earlier slide when I was talking about this Prima Facie case, well, that's where this gets into play, before, but also there. So there'll be a next step analysis that will be done by, depending on the case, our registrar office or legal. Often, more than often, it's part of a multidisciplinary approach within the commission, and then we'll decide if there's if it calls for further investigation or not. And then if it's an investigation, then it will be assigned to an investigator. And that report, that investigation report, the case analysis report, will be provided to commission members. It'll be presented to them at a commission meeting. Commission meets on average 10 times a year, where the investigation staff and the legal staff will present their report and then and present their recommendation, and then commission members will decide what's the next step, if a case gets dismissed or if it goes to a board of inquiry. When it goes to a board of inquiry, that's the equivalent of New Brunswick Administrative Tribunal, which in this case is the Labor and Employment Board. And then the commission will change hat. And when a case goes at that level, then we don't represent the parties, but we represent the public interest, and we'll decide if we participate in those proceedings or not. I'm jumping over a couple of steps. You see, there's a section there about time limit extension. A complaint needs to be filed within 1 year. If it's over 1 year, there's an extra step to determine if accepting a complaint after 1 year is meets a certain requirement, and that's part of that time limit extension drafting. The courts or the legislation states the 1 year time limit. That's a question of fairness, because after a year, if someone hasn't filed after a year, there's a whole presents challenges in terms of locating witnesses and being able to make determination and so on. So that's why the 1 year is established. And then below you have appeals. As one thing about the Human Rights Commission is that I can dismiss complaint at my level, and they can be appealed. And then those appeals will be reviewed by the commission members. So there are some checks and balances that's built into the human rights compliance process. If a file is dismissed at the commission meeting level, then a person can seek a judicial review through the courts. Not as easy, but it's still a step that complainants can avail themselves to, or respondents. And then we have our education and communication process, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in the future slide. What am I doing for time? Okay.
We've just got, we've got about 7 minutes until the 11:55 mark. Although certainly feel free to go till noon instead of 11:55 if you'd like.
Okay. All right. We'll speed it up. So this is pretty telling. This was put together for me a couple of weeks ago, and it gives you an idea of the progression of human rights complaint that the commission is receiving. So if you look for the last 7 or 8 years, yes, it has fluctuated, but pretty much the same. But ever since the pandemic, 2020, 2021, the number of complaints has increased drastically. Now, a lot of those complaints, yes, were dismissed. But if you look at the number of allegations, it's spiked considerably. So that means that a complaint file had more than one grounds or more than one area, but most of the times it's more than one ground. So you see a lot of intersectionality where a complaint of race with social condition in the area of employment or housing and so on. So it's this intersectionality that the commission, through our research, group is looking at extracting more information. Why is that happening?
Marc-Alain, we've
Yep.
got a question.
Yep.
When it comes to service dogs in the workplace, who is responsible to educate the workplace in regards to the rights of the employee and their service dog?
So what's the first part of the question?
When it comes to service dogs in the workplace, who is
Yes.
responsible to educate the employer about the rights of the employee and their service dog?
Good question. So New Brunswick currently does not have a standalone or specific legislation related to service animal, but the Commission a few years ago released a guideline on service animals. We do, it falls under our jurisdiction, and more we're receiving complaints of people who are in area of employment, but also in the area of housing or access to services, deny access to a service because they have a service animal. And then you get into the question of certification and so on. So it can be quite complex. But yes, if someone feels that they've been they've been the subject of a situation involving a service animal, I suggest that they contact the Human Rights Commission and we'll help them with that.
I would also, you said about having created a guide. I would point anyone with questions about the commission or the commission's specific parameters around certain of those prohibited grounds to check out the commission's website. I know I use it in my work quite often, actually, to go see what the commission has already put out about the parameters of those protections.
Yes, absolutely. And I'll talk a little bit more in a second, but in terms of how are we retooling, if you want, or again, to my point earlier about adapting to maybe a different socio-demographics in terms of our offerings when it comes to education and communication, and raising awareness about the Human Rights Act and the compliance process. And I'll touch on this in a second. Another just an idea of how the spread of complaint looks like. By far, complaints are still very much in the employment sector. So we focus a lot of our awareness and education effort for the employment sector, and work with various other agencies to kind of leverage the commission expertise or subject matter expertise in this area. Services is not far behind, and then you have the other areas. Housing is a bit misleading because I personally think that the number of cases is a bit higher, but we're working in this area to get a better understanding of what type of complaints are being filed and what are those circumstances. The last 2 years, if you look at the right of the slide under allegation by grounds, mental disability has surpassed physical disability. And so we've done a few things to in preparation for this. And we started a few years ago when we started to notice this trend in order to, okay, what should we anticipate? It relates to the question that a person asked earlier about, well, how do you make sure that your compliance process or the commission as a whole is accessible to maybe people with mental disability and so on? We look at our process. We make sure that our intake staff are trained in those areas. We even organize sessions, bring in psychologists and other employment and other medical practitioners to present to our commission members about, for example, one of the last one we did was around PTSD, to better understand what is PTSD, how it manifests itself, and how would we be able to recognize it as part of a human rights complaint. And we do this on a regular basis with our commission members and the commission staff. So I mentioned earlier about being a bit presumptuous, where and this, I think this slide is pretty telling. We've had racism, discrimination still occurs despite everybody or many organizations constant attempts and reinventing themselves in order to tackle this huge and well, there's no way to really describe it, but it still happens, and it's going to happen even more because of this how the New Brunswick socio-demographic landscape is changing. It's changing to immigration. It's changing because of people wanted to live here because it's a beautiful country. New Brunswick is a beautiful part of this country. So we're attracting people so they can either work and enjoy all the benefits that we do. But we still have barriers and we still have attitudes to change. So how do we go about that? Under Section 13, it was one of our key principle for us. It's for the principle that every person is free and equal in dignity and rights without regard to any of the protected ground. I'll be honest, it's somewhat of a constant challenge to put this in practice, especially where we're dealing on a case-by-case basis. So the Commission does not have the authority to, like other Human Rights Commission of second generation, to be able to launch our own inquiry based on what we observe or based on the information that we receive as part of our compliance process. So it's very much on a case-by-case basis. People file a complaint, we investigate into it. But there are instances where we're leveraging our expertise, we're leveraging the Commission, and we're partnering with like-minded organizations. So this is a really good example specific to the topic of employment, where in 2018, even before that, there's a federal bill, if you'll recall, to strengthen the labor code, including harassment and sexual harassment. And and then there was a strong emphasis at that time to include an education and an awareness component to this, a training. And so the federal government came up with a proposal in late 2018. We partnered with Public Legal Education and Information Services, NB, in developing a proposal, and which we were successful, which eventually led to Safer Places NB. And I'm sure that most people on this call who deal with, we have a responsibility in the world of employment are probably familiar with this platform. So this is a really good example of the Commission collaborating with another New Brunswick agency in order to improve the programming and tools for employers to address and make sure that our workplace are safe and secure, and that we prevent sexual harassment.
And actually, we have Amber Chisholm from Please, and it's speaking about Safer Places tomorrow.
Yes, yeah, great segue, and it's been a fantastic partnership with Amber, Amber now, and with Deborah before. Still conscious of time, but I want to finish, and I'm almost done. On the advocacy side, education, the Commission is very much involved with in different ways in order to make sure that we stay abreast on those lived experiences of New Brunswickers, and especially considering the changing face of our population, of our society. So a couple of examples. Human Rights in New Brunswick is a brochure that it's just a 2-pager. We've really simplified it. It's been translated in 7 languages. We'll do the launch of this fairly soon. And it's to make sure that anyone in New Brunswick understands and knows that there's a Human Rights Commission, and there's the process that they can access if they feel they've been victim of discrimination or the subject of discrimination. The Prudes All Women Project is just a fantastic opportunity. Our chair is a member of this group, where was lost in St. John, where we where we have a first-hand account of those lived experiences of people and the challenges that they face, not only immigrating to New Brunswick, but starting a new life here. And what can the Commission do in terms of changing or updating our programming to address some of those challenges. As a subject matter expert, we lend a hand to the Department of Education, who develop a fantastic platform to help daycare operators understand what's their obligation, but also their right dealing with accommodation. So we've partnered with them or collaborated, lent our support and our expertise to make sure that the platform, when it comes to human rights, reflects the principle of the Human Rights Act in New Brunswick. We also try to, as much as possible, inform our legislators about specific legislation and to lend a human rights lens into their proceedings. And the chair and I recently presented to the Select Committee on Accessibility in New Brunswick. We'll also do it on with the committees on public accounts and so on. Very quickly about systemic discrimination. There's a lot of things that we do because of the nature of our structure, but also confidentiality that people don't see. So when a complaint is settled, our mediators will work with the parties to reach a resolution. And often those resolutions are financial in nature, but also will include training for the organization, development of different policies if they didn't have any. It could be a case of sexual harassment. Organization did not have a policy on sexual harassment, and now as part of this complaint, they do. Again, it's a one-off, but at least it's one area where the compliance process was able to help those parties improve their ability to deal with future situations. So it's maintaining that conversation. When cases goes to a board of inquiry, that's where they have the real potential to address and to address systemic discrimination. For example, various remedies that the board can order. It could be a policy that's discriminatory. They can order to change it. It could be a piece of legislation that's discriminatory in nature, and they will. The board can look into it. The other aspect too is around, and I mentioned that earlier about our participation with the Canadian, with CASHRA, Canadian Statutory Human Rights Agencies, where there's constant work to be done, both internally to make sure that our people, our investigators, our legal practitioners, our mediators, our registrar can share with their colleagues to harmonize practices, but also that this harmonization takes place at the legislative aspect, that the protection afforded to a New Brunswicker are similar in Manitoba or from a federal perspective and so on. So we share a lot about the impacts of integrating or including new grounds into our legislation. And on a last note, this is from the Standing Senate Committee on Human Rights, and I think it's very telling that human rights is not just about a compliance process where people can access if they feel they've been the victim or the subject of a discriminatory practice. It's about being able to also being able to inform the public policy process. And to use the data, the information that we have as subject matter expert in order to inform those processes. And that's it. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Marc-Alain. Thank you so much for coming and battling through the technical difficulties this morning and presenting for us. I think that understanding the remedies available to people, but also understanding that those efforts for education are continuing to happen in the province is really important. If anyone has any questions for you, I presume they contact you or the other members of the commission or your staff via the contact information on the screen.
Yes, they can contact me directly, or they can call the commission and speak with one of our registry officer or intake officer, and we'll take it from there. There's just before I end, there's one thing that I meant to raise, is that and we see it in a lot of agencies and organizations. It doesn't have to be. It's not only public; it's also private, where sometimes those processes can be lengthy and there's backlog. We do our best to make it as efficient, but as you can imagine, it's a legal process. So there's the access to justice, but there's also procedural fairness. And on this note, the commission was recently approved quite a significant increase in resourcing by the government.
Wonderful.
So we're in the process of implementing those changes, but we'll have more investigators. So we'll be able to further deal with this backlog and be more responsive. So just to say that it's it's not lost on government that this is it's a very important process, and the commission was quite pleased with this new development.
Yes, I could certainly say. I mean, we've had the commission present a number of times over the years at Respectful Workplace Week. I know I've interacted with the commission in my work in workplace conflict management, and the folks who work at the commission work so hard and are so passionate about protecting the rights of New Brunswickers, or helping New Brunswickers access those protections and address those wrongs. And yet, when you are so backlogged, I can imagine how difficult it is. So it's very exciting to hear that there's that increase and that real valuation by the provincial government on the work the commission's doing.